Irene, thank you so much for joining us and being willing to be our first person again. So we are very grateful for you for doing this. You have so much to share with us. We have such a short period, so we'll just start right off, if you don't mind, if that's okay. You described for me that the time for you and your family in Czechoslovakia before World War II and the Holocaust as a time of hard work, but also a good life, one in which there was a sense of safety, you said. Before we turn to the war years, tell us a little bit about that life in Czechoslovakia before the war began.
Yeah. Well, during the Czech government, we felt protected, and most of all, we felt equal. We were not looked at as a separate group. And it's very comforting to belong to the country in which you were born. After all, you're a citizen. So that made a huge difference. They provided schooling for the children, and realizing that a lot of the children were Jewish, they accommodated us by not holding school on the Sabbath, which was very helpful and very considerate.
And you had said that you really didn't have a sense of anti-Semitism at all at that time.
That's right. And then we were feeling comfortable the way people ought to in their own homes and in their own country.
Irene, tell us a little about your mother and father.
Well, there were 6 children in my family. And by 1944, when a tragedy happened to us, the ages were between 7 and 17. And it's a very busy household. Everything that we ate, cooked, baked was all done in the house. There were no stores, no bakeries. It was a farming village. And the food was wonderful, but the women worked from morning till night. And we as children, I enjoyed watching the process. How is butter made? You know, how are preserves made? How are noodles made, etc. And I would follow the grown-ups watching how they produced all this magical food.
In fact, you described it as you were watching things that helped you later in life, the things that you observed.
Well, yes. I mean, it's things don't come from packages frozen from the grocery store, you know. So it tasted a whole lot better than that stuff. You know, the food was so important. And the kitchen always smelled wonderful. Something was cooking and baking all the time. So it was a happy place to be. And then we observed the Jewish holidays where special foods were prepared and special preparation in every way to get the house ready. So this was a busy family with everything.
Microphone's not on? Uh-oh. Sorry, Tom. Oh, excuse us for a moment. Technical thing. When the technology works, it's phenomenal. Which is most of the time.
Okay. Is that better?
No, you're not hearing that? No, okay.
Okay. Is that better?
Are you able to hear that? Okay.
Yes?
I think so.
Can they hear me?
Yeah, okay, good.
Okay.
Well, Thank you. I'm sorry about that, Irene.
That's okay, it happens. Yeah.
Irene, by the time Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, which of course launched World War II, your community had already experienced profound change. Hungary was an ally of Nazi Germany, and earlier in 1939, your community had been occupied by Hungarians, and that immediately changed your lives. Will you say something about
Yes.
that?
Well, it's amazing what a change in government meant to us. When, as I was saying before, that we felt a sense of belonging and citizenship the way it is usually felt by people who were born in a place. All of a sudden, with the Hungarian regime, we were no longer considered citizens, and we no longer were protected by the law. And it is a very frightening thing. Our status hasn't changed, but their perception of us did. And I know my parents were worried about the children, and they were worried about our future.
And among the many things that the Hungarian government did to restrict your lives, your father, I believe, lost his business.
Yes, they confiscated his business and gave it to a non-Jew. And this kind of activity spread all through the region. Businesses were confiscated. Professional people lost their Jewish professionals. Teachers, lawyers, doctors, they lost their jobs. And so there was a general isolation and hostility towards us, which is very, very scary. We can't, it's very difficult to explain what it's like where you are not accepted and you don't know what you have done wrong. You have done nothing wrong.
And one of the ways it affected you is with respect to your schooling, isn't that right?
Yes, Jewish children could not attend Hungarian schools. And the isolation and discrimination escalated until we had to wear a yellow star on our clothes. So that really put an end to our movement because we were scared to leave our home and definitely scared to leave our local community where we were a target for anyone who wanted to do any harm, humiliate, scare, bully. It was just not safe to go into the street anymore, and I had a particularly scary experience traveling on a train, on a 5-minute trip with my father from one little town to the other, and he was recognized as being Jewish by a group of hoodlums who were on the train, and they gathered around him and began to bully him and discuss among themselves, wouldn't it be great to, what shall we do with him? Wouldn't it be great to throw him off the train? And they laughed and carried on, saying, oh yeah, that would be just great. And there I am, like 12 years old. And
that must have been terrifying.
Absolutely terrified, because I can't defend him, and no one else in the train said anything. And so fortunately, our trip was very short. We recognized the terrain, that our train will stop soon at our destination, and that's what happened. We got off. And after that, my father never got on a train again.
Never got on a train again.
So incidents like that made us hunker down, worry, and just hope that we can get by each day without some major tragedy.
And you would continue living under the Hungarians for several years, and you shared with me that occasionally someone would have escaped from Poland or Ukraine and would come to your town and talk about what was happening to Jews elsewhere. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, we heard there was severe persecution in other countries of Jews. And yes, in Poland, which was occupied by Nazi Germany, there was a lot of, there were problems with the Jews. We heard about it. We heard that people were collected and taken into the forest and literally mowed down, you know, by gunfire, and that people were pushed into synagogues and burned alive and things like that. And we really did not believe it. And as you say, occasionally somebody from that area would escape and hide out in our area. And they would tell us these stories and more, horrible stories of killings and of children and women, and we thought that they were exaggerating.
That it couldn't be like
that. Couldn't be possible.
And of course, in Hungary and in Czechoslovakia, where you were in 1942, your father, along with thousands of other men, Jewish men, were forced to do forced labor for the Hungarian military. Tell us what it meant for your father to be forced into one of these labor brigades, and then what it meant for your family.
Yes. Well, it was wartime, but Jewish men were not conscripted into the war. They were not trusted with a gun, and so they were basically called in to do forced labor at the front, places where it was most dangerous, and they were abused in addition to being exposed to the greatest danger. And so we knew that might end up that he would not come back alive, and that was really the way it was with most of the young men who were taken into these labor brigades, never returned.
I mean, many of them were forced to walk through minefields to clear the minefields,
Yes.
do things like that.
Right. It was really a most disrespectful way. But their idea was that these were not people who are loyal to the government, which was not true.
Was not true.
People who were born there love their country and will protect it. But so my father, we were quite amazed and happy that after about 6 months he did come back. And at that point, the Hungarian government still made some distinction between young men who were not married and had no families, and someone like my father who had 6 children. So they actually did send him home. But he was shaken. He was never the same. He witnessed and experienced terrible things, and he by this time had lost his business, and so the family was in great danger now of no income with 6 children, and also the constant worry and fear of what else will they do to us, what will come next.
And of course, while he was gone, your mother with 6 children is taking care,
Yes.
trying to manage everybody, feed everybody.
Yes, it was a very hard time. We had no idea that worse things were to come.
And they certainly did. As difficult as it was under the Hungarian rule, it turned suddenly, dramatically, and tragically worse in March of 1944 when the Germans invaded Hungary. Tell us about that time and, of course, what happened to your family once the Germans came in.
Once the Germans came in and occupied Hungary, things happened very fast to Jews. In our little town and in our community, within 2 weeks of the German army arriving, we were being moved into ghettos. 2 weeks. This super manager of the Jewish question, Adolf Eichmann, he was well experienced in how to organize people and arrange for cattle trains and to get the movement going, and he was ready in 2 weeks.
In 2
and
weeks.
it was very sudden. We had no idea. All the things we experienced before, we were still in our home, we were still feeling somewhat protected by our neighbors who knew us, my family for generations. But suddenly an announcement was made that we are to leave our home and we are to take a suitcase each, and the next morning be out of our home and gather in a gathering place for further instructions not to leave one's home with young children without knowing that we're not going to be protected must have been terribly scary for my parents.
Irene, if you don't mind, maybe tell us just a little bit about why Germany invaded Hungary, because Hungary was their ally. They were,
Yes.
they were their soulmates.
Yes, Hungary was their ally, but this was towards the end of the war, 1944, and by this time, Germany was losing the war, it was evident. And so Hungary decided to pull out of the alliance because it seemed to them that they will be on the losing end. And so this sudden occurrence changed our lives and the lives of 400,000 Hungarian Jews who in very short time ended up in trains headed for Auschwitz.
Over 400,000 in just a
Over
matter of weeks.
400,000. And this Adolf Eichmann, who was this great organizer, he had everything prepared to get the trains, that many cattle cars in wartime where they needed the trains for the soldiers and movement of war, but they took the trains away from that, were more important to get the Jewish population to Auschwitz and proceed with the killing.
Irene, as you were started to tell us, you were told you had to leave your home, pack a little case, and you were sent for a short period to a ghetto in Munkaj.
Yes.
What do you remember of that?
Well, this was a horrendous experience because they took us, first of all, a delegation, after the announcement that we are to leave the next morning, a delegation of local officials came to our house and told my father that they came to tell him that he is to give them all our money and all our valuables, and that they know that he owned a small business and they expected that he had things to give them, and they were not polite about it. They said, you must give us what you have. So he apparently gave them some things, but as far as jewelry, we had the usual, wedding rings and watches. There was no big expensive things in the family, but he did give them. And then, of course, we understood at this point that somehow they're not only taking us out of our home, they're depriving us of our property, what we leave behind and what we could be taking with us, and that things looked very dark.
For the period you were in the Munkaj ghetto, what were the conditions like for you in there?
Oh, that really was impossible, because they brought in the Jewish families from many regions into this one gathering place. It ended up that by the time they collected the people from all the many villages, there were something like 10,000 people in this one location. It was a brick factory that had some grounds, and it had some barracks for the purpose of the factory, and was not prepared whatsoever for civilians with all the many needs. There was no sanitation, there was no running water, there was no kitchen, there was no facility for sick people. It was a dumping place. It was what we didn't realize and never quite accepted, that it can get worse. What we didn't realize that they were just housing us there for a short period until they can get the trains moving.
Right.
And so it was a terrible time. The food we brought from home was soon gone, and we had to depend on ladles of soup and a piece of bread. And we were all families laid out the blanket on the floor, and that was our home. And there was a lot of harsh treatment, a great deal of threats, restriction of movement, They would call the fathers, the men in for interrogation, and demanding more valuables and more money. It was very important to them to take all you had and not to take anything with you, because they knew the end result, but we didn't.
You didn't know.
And so it was a very scary place. They had all kinds of harsh rules about what we can do and what we can't. And at one point they made an announcement that girls under 16 who report to a certain place to have their hair cut, or your father will be punished. And so I heard it outdoors somewhere, and I didn't even ask my mother. I ran to this place and sat down and had my braids cut off. And then I went back to our place. And
you were 13 years old.
I was 13 years old at the time. But I was so scared that my father would be punished. It never occurs to me that I shouldn't do that. I just did it. And when I got back to our place, my mother gave me a kerchief to put on, and I don't think either one of us grieved very much about it, because by that time we had been so humiliated and so frightened that even I, as a 13-year-old, felt, well, the hair will grow out someday. But it turned out that, unbeknownst to us, when I got to Auschwitz, this had, I believe, gave me my first chance to survive the selection, because having had a kerchief on my head and a very big coat that I had on, the Nazi who was doing the separation as to who should live and who should die mistook me for an older person.
And because you'd had your braids cut up and you had
Yes.
a kerchief, you looked a little older.
Right, and so I had no idea that was to be, yes.
Irene, tell us about arriving at Auschwitz, if you don't mind. And we saw that photograph in the beginning of the program, where we actually have a photograph of Irene after arriving in Auschwitz. Tell us about that.
Well, the trip itself was horrific, and that our realization that we're heading for Poland made the grown-ups review and remember what they heard from those few escaped people who came from Poland, and told us that people were being shot in forests in Poland. And so the talk in the cattle car by the grown-ups was that that's what will happen to us when the doors open. We will be in the forest in Poland and we will all be shot. That now we remembered, we were told, and we were heading for Poland, and that was the accepted scary thing that the grown-ups were talking about. And so when the cattle cars arrived in Auschwitz and the doors were opened from the outside, my father said that he saw barracks, and he saw prisoners in striped uniform, and he saw guard towers and things like that. And he said, well, this isn't a forest in Poland. It looks like a work camp. And everybody relaxed a little bit. They said, well, if we have to work, we can do some of that. We can do that. And so that first arrival was somewhat of a relief. Again, we were totally ignorant of anything that was going on. We never heard of Auschwitz. In all those years that Auschwitz was,
mention of it.
Never heard of Auschwitz. We just heard about brutality in Poland and in the Ukraine, about soldiers killing people, and mass graves and things like that. Not the gas chambers and the systematic, killing of what amounted to genocide of the Jewish people. So when the doors opened, we heard a lot of yelling and shouting, and in German and in other languages, get out, fast, get out, and leave everything behind. And there was a great deal of harsh language, and there were Nazi soldiers with dogs, and it was just a kind of a hysterical atmosphere of rush and, great urgency. And so we just leave everything behind, and that in itself, as you can see that first you leave your job, you lose your job, then you lose your home, and then you lose your...
What few things you were able to bring.
Right, and then now you leave all that you had and just have what you had on you. Right. And so the terror mounts and the uncertainty grows, and no one tells you that there'll be any relief or anything good would come out of it. And as I grew up and got married and had children, I kept rethinking how my parents must have suffered for their children, being helpless to take care of them and seeing and expecting the worst, which definitely happened. So when we were finally out, everybody jumped out and left stuff behind. The prisoners, who were Jewish prisoners, men, would jump into these cattle cars and dump all the stuff out onto the platform, and there were trucks waiting, and other prisoners were filling the trucks with it. So there was a general cleanup right away of all that arrived, and then there was shouting and yelling orders. And the first order was that men should line up to one side and women and children to another side. And so within minutes, the men, my father and 16-year-old brother with all the other men were lined up in one side. And the women and children, we were on the platform, and the crowd was moving up. We couldn't see the front. We just moved with the crowd. And we were guarded by Nazi soldiers. And all of a sudden, we were in the front, and we faced about a dozen Nazi soldiers standing there with dogs and their guns, and one of them was holding a stick, and he was very efficiently and very quickly separating people. As a family arrived in front of him, as we did, in a matter of seconds, we were torn apart. My 17-year-old sister, Serena, was immediately sent to one side. My mother, 2 little boys, to another side. My father and 16-year-old brother were already separated. And so in a matter of seconds, I was left with my younger sister holding hands. And in just really seconds, he put the stick between us and made her go to where our mom went, and made me go to where my older sister went. And I moved to a little bit to one side, as the picture showed, but I didn't leave. I was so stunned that my younger sister would now be alone and will not catch up to our mother, because the flow of people was continuing. Lots of people had gone in that direction where the mothers and children went, and she had to go alone, and I immediately understood that she will not catch up, and that suddenly became the most scary and devastating thing to me, that she will not catch up. And we also made some civilized assumptions that if this is a work camp and the women and children are separated and elderly, then there will be a reunion periodically, right? Mm-hmm. And everything was suddenly going through my head. How will she know who she is, how to catch up? How will we ever have a reunion? Nobody asks your name, and suddenly it occurred to me there are no papers, there is nothing. What will this reunion be like? But I focused on her. She will be lost to us, and I wouldn't leave. I was sort of allowed to hang around a few seconds, as around me people were moving. But after a while, somebody motioned me, and I moved and went towards where the young adults went, my sister and Serena and other young adults. And I yelled her name, and she turned around and said to me, "Why didn't you go with Mom?" And my answer to her was that Edith will never catch up with our mom. Something terrible happened. I lost her. I don't know why he separated me. I don't know what happened. I was holding on to her. I was just babbling that as though I did something wrong. I somehow let her go, and this is terrible. This is the worst thing that happened today. Obviously, I didn't even know where all were going, that they were heading towards the gas chambers, and that what we found out soon, that within a half hour to an hour, they were all dead. And one could never have believed if someone had told us that during that time of separation. It was just a question of how will we handle that reunion, since we are all going to be working here.
So now you're with Serena.
So now I'm with her, and we're off to a processing place at the bathhouse where everyone's hair was cut, and all our clothes was taken and disinfected. We were disinfected and put through a humiliating processing of young women being shaved body and hair by men in a crude and rude way, and no sensitivity of any kind, and just like bodies being moved, and then very fast moving through a shower, and then to pick up the uniform and out the door and lined up, as we had suddenly come from another planet, because we all looked the same with the shaved heads and the dress. All of a sudden, these young women who had been in civilian, every kind of person and job and talent and profession, all of a sudden looked like people from another planet, literally. And so our time in Auschwitz began. The first thing we asked when we got to the barracks, we asked the first people who had come before us, so when is this reunion? Most important thing to us. And they pointed to chimneys and smoking chimneys and belching fire, and they said, "That's where your families are." So again, we dismissed it and began to realize that we're in a strange place where people say strange things.
I can't imagine as a 13-year-old trying to even begin to grasp what they were really saying to you.
Now, things happen so fast that your perception, you couldn't take it all in. Things were strange and odd and unreal, and you could not absorb it. But you heard these scary things that were also not believable.
And yet, in the midst of that, astonishingly, you encountered a couple of your aunts.
Yes, that one incredible thing that I know saved my life was in the mass of numbers and people, women, all looking so much alike that it was hard to distinguish who was who. Outside of the barracks, where it was wall-to-wall people, we literally stepped over my mother's two young sisters who had arrived the day before, and they were milling around with others there, and they recognized us and we recognized them. And so we then ended up in the barrack with them, which for me as a 13-year-old, I suddenly thought that I'm safe. All my terror diminished because they were in their mid-20s. Back home, I referred to them as aunt and used the respectful way of talking to them. They were wonderful to the grandchildren. They were my mother's sisters. And to have them with me, I felt like I had my parents back, my mother back. I didn't know that they had little power to protect me, but emotionally, I was able suddenly the terror left me, literally. And they continued to protect me and my sister as much as they could emotionally.
Right.
In any other way, they certainly had no power to protect me.
Once you knew that you were selected to then do labor, tell us what you were made to do.
Well, things in this strange, otherworldly place, there were things going on. And so they were trying, all these thousands of young adults that they had, the Germans were sorting them out and assigning work. So they selected 1,000 women. They made us line up and they said, this is going to be a work group, and line up.
And it included your aunts?
I included my aunts, and we made sure at this point that we still stuck together, which is terribly important, and that they lined us up at a certain place, that you will be 1,000 women at a workplace, a work assignment, and rumor had it that this was an okay place, among the women. Rumors fly, though, don't line up here, this is not going to be a good assignment. Nobody really knew what was going on, but rumor had it this might be a good assignment. So we lined up and they tattooed us. They took hours of tattooing 1,000 women, after which proceeded to walk us through many gates within Auschwitz. So this work assignment was within Birkenau. There were many sub-camps separated by electrified fencing. And so we were marched out in the morning to this place. And in this place, we realized that this is where they brought all the stuff that came out of the trains.
That you described earlier being gathered and taken away.
Yes, all that, the trucks took all of it here. But it wasn't just from one train. It was like, apparently there were like 114 cattle trains that came from Germany within 6 weeks to 2 months. 114 trains, huge long trains, and something like 400,000 people were brought into Auschwitz. The amount of stuff people brought were really mountains of stuff dumped into this area, which now became a storage area. And they needed labor to sort the stuff out. First of all, bring it into the barracks out of the weather, and then for many months after, continue to sort them out and put them in categories, take off labels, and ship all of it back to Germany for the use of the German population. And so all of a sudden, we understood the magnitude of the people and what was going on here, because there would be thousands of eyeglasses in a pile. There'd be thousands of toothbrushes. There would be thousands and thousands of shoes of every size.
And because of where you were, you could see the scope of this.
We saw it. We had to realize that every one of those items belonged to a person. And they were also, whatever people brought, depending on how long they were in the ghetto and came from there or came right from home. So there was everything. There were even things that people thought they might use, like musical instruments, or bottles of perfume, let's say, or there would be leather goods, books, just about anything, a household.
I can imagine children had children's books with them.
There were tremendous amount of children's things, baby carriages, and all kinds of items that children need, because that was people's focus, bring things the children would need. And so we were assigned to do this work. And in addition to this, understanding that these people, each item represents a person and they're gone, we were also unfortunate enough to be an electrified fence away from gas chamber number 4 in Auschwitz and the crematorium that went with it. And now we not only were we told that people are being gassed here upon arrival and that children and women and elderly are being killed here, we saw,
You saw it.
people coming from the train platform, huge columns of people passing our barracks and walk into the gate, and we could see, they would even talk to us, ask in Hungarian, who are you, where are you from? We couldn't say anything to them, it was too late. And they would enter the gate, and then day and night we saw the chimneys belching smoke and fire. We just saw them, and now they're gone. And there was such a huge number of people coming so fast that the 4 functioning gas chambers in Auschwitz and crematoriums couldn't keep up with the killing, and they could not keep up with the disposal of the bodies in the crematoriums. So right across the fence from us, they had dug pits into which they dumped the bodies and were burning them. There were fires, huge fires. And then the people we also had they had a system, they had us working night shift, because there was so much stuff to sort. Right. So one week we would work at night and another week during the day. So during the night, the transports kept coming day and night, and the crowds of people coming off the platform into this gas chamber kept coming. And when they approached the fires that they saw, it was in sort of a wooded area, but the flames from the chimney and the fires from the pits they looked like they were walking into the fire. And they cried, and they prayed, and they screamed, and they pleaded to God and man.
And you saw this day after day?
I was outside at night. I saw it, I heard it. I would go like this, pluck my ears. I could not absorb the cries and the terrible praying and crying.
Irene,
and then there would be silence.
And then silence.
I had to, I never absorbed it, I never understood it, I never even believed it, yet I saw it.
You saw it. Irene, there's so much more that you could tell us about Auschwitz and what you went through with your sisters and your aunts, what you saw, and I know we're not going to be able to cover it all. Tell us what you can about your father and your brother were also selected for labor when you first came in. What do you know about your father and your brother?
Well, first of all, the men were lined up there on the side as we arrived, and they watched their families being torn apart, and that there was nothing they could do about it. Since we were in this location, and we realized that we were alongside gas chamber number 4, we saw the men across the fence, and during times when we were working outdoors, my 2 aunts attempted to make some eye contact with the men on the other side, whose job it was to burn the bodies, to pull them out of the gas chambers and into the crematoriums or into the pits. One of my aunts and I were out there, and she was very brave. Now, she was pulling towards the fence, and a guy on the other side was getting closer to the fence also. And there was a guard tower right there, and I remember I was always so frightened. I was desperately frightened. And so the closer my aunt went to the fence, the more I backed away from the fence. I didn't want to see what will happen next. I was so frightened. But anyway, I actually did recognize an 18-year-old young guy from a family from my town. I recognized him. He was very dark because he worked outside with the smoke and flames, but I recognized him. And he managed, with my aunt being so brave, he managed to throw a note over to my aunt. She picked it up and showed it to her sister, my other aunt, and between the two of them, they decided to tell us only some of what they heard. So what they heard was he was from our town, and the younger men from our town were at the selection, at the arrival, were assigned to work at this gas chamber crematorium, and that my father had been there, that he lasted but a few weeks, and he was shot because he couldn't do the work, and that he was dead. This young man continued to work. Eventually, he was shot too. But my two aunts didn't tell us the full story because they wanted to spare us, my sister and me. But they just told us that, yes, he had been there, but that he is no longer alive. So this is what we heard about him. And we don't know anything what happened to my 16-year-old brother who was with him upon arrival. And for some reason, we never, ever could find anyone who knew anything about him during the time we were there or after, where people tried to talk to survivors and try to see, do you know so-and-so? Did you recognize so-and-so? You know, did anybody know this young boy? Nobody ever heard of him. Nobody had any trace of him.
To this day.
To this day. We traced him. My daughter traced him for years with the Red Cross. We just wanted to know what happened to this young man who was 16 years old. He most likely was not selected to stay with my father because they selected older, stronger-looking people. It was difficult work, I understand. And that he probably just was alone and never had a chance.
Irene, we're in the little time we have left, tell us what you can about, by January of 1945, as the Russians were advancing and Germany was losing the war, you were forced out to other camps on a death march. Tell us, to the extent you can, where you went, what happened to your aunts, and then your liberation.
In January 1945, when the Russian army was approaching Auschwitz, instead of allowing us, the prisoners, to be liberated, the Nazis had another idea. Very hard for me to understand why that's what they chose, but they decided to empty the surviving people and take them on a death march, literally on a death march through the highways of Germany and the back roads in the snow and ice. And we just marched, and if you sat down, you were shot. If you leaned on someone, you were shot. They almost never stopped. We just walked and walked, mainly through back roads. I don't think they took us on the highways where things were going on. But anyway, we were taken deeper into Germany. For days and days, we were marching, and our numbers were diminished. There were dead people along the gutters. It was impossible to survive. Most people didn't have the right shoes, and it was desperately cold. Occasionally, they would stop in some farm along the way and let us stay a few hours, and then no food, no water. We ate the snow wherever we passed, there was no snow left. And eventually, after days, they put us in open cattle cars, which apparently was worse than walking in the winter, because the wind blew into every bit of the open cattle car, and it was not a survivable situation. And yet somehow, well, I think they took all these thousands of survivors basically to diminish their numbers. There's some evidence from that they hope to keep some slave labor, that we were taken deeper, those that would survive deeper into Germany to work in munitions factories and continue the slave labor, so it's possible. But they did not feed us or take care of us in a way that would
make that
possible. So we ended up from Poland in Auschwitz, near Hamburg, Germany, in a concentration camp. In this place, the Germans, their system broke down already. They were running away from the Russian army too. So they literally stopped feeding us. We were there 5 more months before the Russian army caught up with us there. During those 5 months, terrible things happened. Typhus broke out, and one of my aunts caught typhus. And, amazingly, this camp did not have a gas chamber, but selections continued even here. So the sick were obviously selected. A truck came from another concentration camp, from Ravensbrück, where there was a gas chamber. And they picked up the sick and the weak and took them. So selection continued. Feeding stopped. We were literally starving, losing all our weight. And the infestation of lice that caused the typhus. So it was the last chance of survival. So my aunt was taken. My other aunt became very, very sick. She was feverish and lying on the floor. I think she had pneumonia. During this few days, my sister was selected, because they lined us up every morning to select the week.
And so they looked at your sister, saw
she was picked out.
Yeah.
And there I was, the panic that I always had returned in a very big way. I spoke up and I said, I am her sister. And they said, well, you can go too. Mm-hmm. And so I did.
And you knew what was going to happen?
I knew, she knew.
Yeah.
But no way was I going to be alone. Mm-hmm. The terror was so enormous in me, that I just remember thinking, no, I will not be here alone. I cannot be alone. I think my 13 years of age had a lot to do with that, because I was simply a terrified child. So they locked us in a room with many others like us, all emaciated, and we were waiting for the truck to come. And for some reason that day, the truck did not arrive because of the war situation on the highway. And at the end of the day, somebody pushed the door and it gave, and one by one we got out of the room and went back to our barrack. And when we got in there, my aunt was still lying feverishly on the floor, and the other women, they all burst out saying, the children came back, the children came back.
Meaning you and Serena.
Yes,
yeah.
And we were just astonished to be called children, because children were not to live in this area, in this world.
So they never acknowledged you as children?
Never. It was a big secret that we were never referred to as children, and we're just hoping that the Germans didn't think so either. But suddenly they were crying and they were happy that the children came back. So after this, soon the Russian army soldiers did arrive in the camp. But realizing that there was typhus there, they left, and they never came back. So we were certainly abandoned, very sick and very needy of every help, transportation, food, medicine, just, survival. And a lot of the people, a lot of the survivors who could have lived and survived died after liberation because things were...
There was no care for them.
No care. And so to briefly summarize, we literally walked up the highway. After a while, after we didn't leave the place right away, we had to stay because we had no strength. So after a while, people moved into the next village. There always was a village near every concentration camp, pretty much by the same name as the camp. So there was this nice village, but it had many empty houses because the civilian population fled.
The German civilian population.
The Germans were coming, so we moved into one of the houses.
Yep.
But we were in bad shape, and my Aunt Rose, we put her in the hospital. She was very close to death. Took us many months of hitchhiking and every other way to make our way to Prague, where eventually we got into a hospital and had some help and began to, inquire who was alive and who was dead, and try to figure out which of my extended family survived.
And there were a couple of members of the extended family that came back.
There were a few young adults who survived, and one who had, the only one who in his early 20s escaped to what was then Palestine, left the family. He returned as a Czechoslovak soldier in a British uniform. He was actually near Prague. We made contact with him. He took us under his wing. He was a soldier. He had privileges. He took us to where he was stationed. He fed us from the military kitchen. He took his sister into a hospital. He did for us what we needed very badly. And from then he made contact with a few of his brothers, young adults. But basically, at the end, in my family, only Serena and I survived. My father, mother, 4 siblings, everyone was gone, killed. My grandparents, other uncles and aunts who had families, 2 children with this couple, uncle and aunt, 2 couples, 2 children with the other couple, all the elderly. I mean, it was a slaughter.
Of almost your entire family.
The entire family. And in our village, in our very small farming village, where there were only 10 Jewish families, and I counted the total number of persons, no more than 100. 10 returned.
10 returned.
And my sister and I were the only 2 children. 8 adults and 2 children out of approximately 100 persons. And there was families that were totally wiped out. That young man that worked as a Sonderkommando at the crematorium, he was killed. He had many brothers and sisters. Their entire family was wiped out. No one came back.
Irene, I think we probably all know that we wish we had a lot more time because there's so much more you could have shared with us, but thank you so much for that. I'm going to turn back to Irene in just a couple of moments to close our program. I want to thank you all for being here. We didn't have time for questions. Irene's going to stay behind when she finishes here on the stage, and we invite you to come up on the stage if you would like, meet her, ask a question if you'd like to do that. Give her a hug, whatever you want to do. I think you're welcome to do that. I want to remind you that we have first-person programs each Wednesday and Thursday until the 9th of August. I hope you can come back. But all of our programs are available on the museum's YouTube page, so you can see Irene's and other programs as well. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person has the last word. And so I'd like to turn to Irene to close today's program.
Well, thank you very much. We have learned from this tragedy that teaching of hate can make people believe that genocide is possible, even a patriotic duty, that killing a civilian population, including their children, is necessary. Now, humanity's vulnerability to hate and violence demands constant vigilance and readiness to speak out against those who seek to dehumanize and divide us. As a survivor, building faith in people and their institutions takes a long time. A lifetime may not be enough. But there are people everywhere who believe that race, color, and religion do not set us apart, that we all belong to the human race. I want to thank you for coming to the museum and to coming to hear me and to hear such a sad tale, to hear my story, and to be interested in this topic, in this tragic story. It will ensure that when you go back and tell others, it will ensure that this story will never be forgotten. So thank you very much for coming here. And I'm sorry that I had to share such a sad story with you. Thank you very much.